Hello, everyone, and welcome to our CrimeView customer webinar, which is going to be a monthly series that we've just begun. It's going to take place the third Wednesday of every month, and we're really glad you've joined us. It'll be at the same time, so if you want to mark your calendars, you can certainly do that to block off this time, or we'll also be providing a link to the recording of today's presentation. So for anyone that's not able to join the live event, we'll make sure to get a recording out to you as well. One of the benefits, though, of joining the live events is that you can ask your specific questions. So today we have Dean who's going to be walking you through a topic. We'll have different topics each month, but if you do have a question specific to Dean's topic, you can go ahead and enter your question into the GoToWebinar dashboard. If that does collapse at any time throughout today's presentation, you can expand it by clicking on that arrow. Okay. I'm going to be handing things over to Dean, who's a senior implementation specialist with us. He's going to be speaking about using CrimeView to identify trends and patterns, and I'm going to let Dean go into a little bit more about what that means. All right, welcome, Dean.
All right, thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. My name's Dean Daniel. As Sherry mentioned, I'm a senior implementation specialist here with TriTech. I've been here going on about 7 or 8 years. So I may have worked with some of you. I recognize a few of the names on the list. So as she said, today is kind of the first in our series of webinars we'll be doing to kind of present focus pieces of features, tools, functionality in the dashboard application, presenting those kind of in these theme-based webinars. And so the first one we'll be doing today is identifying trends and patterns using CrimeView. And CrimeView leverages a variety of different tools that can reveal various trends and patterns in the data. But from a crime analysis perspective, there's a distinct difference between what a trend is and what a pattern is. So we'll kind of go over both of those. So specifically with the trends, usually some sort of long-term rise or fall temporally in the data doesn't usually include, or examine similarities between individual crime types or crimes. Whereas a crime pattern is more focused, usually a group of 2 or more or several incidents or calls that are unique in that they share some sort of commonality. So it could be very specific, like officer MO, victim characteristics, property taken, but also the idea of spatial or temporal proximity or similarity to one another. And that latter part is where the dashboard really excels in identifying those kind of spatial and temporal trends in the data. And we can also leverage existing attributes in the data sets, pieces of information to focus in and refine what we're looking at in context or relation to these hotspots. So as a crime analyst, some of these patterns may be obvious, when and where your burglaries are occurring, that kind of thing. But keep in mind the dashboard is designed to provide an array of info to a variety of users, some of which might not be as attuned to these things. And as an analyst, it also provides an excellent way to visualize and present these patterns to others, or for whatever reason. It might also help kind of elucidate some trends or patterns in the data that you wouldn't have anticipated. Okay, so let's get right into it. First, we'll be going through identifying spatial and temporal hotspots using the heat map, temporal grid, and time sequencer. So all of these tools are available in the filter widget in the dashboard mode here. So the filter widget is a pin map, one record or symbol on the map for each record. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this widget for property crime for the last 28 days. So right off the bat, there's a lot going on. 819 records. I have to zoom in extremely tight to get them to break out. At this point, you kind of get a general sense of the geographic distribution of these records, maybe some sense of where there's clustering going on, but nothing discernible or actionable in terms of a spatial pattern of any kind. So in order to get a clear picture here, and I'll zoom back a little bit, I can turn on the heat map. And so the heat map is kind of these red, yellow blobs, for lack of a better term, that are identifying clustering of activity. And the closer I zoom in, the more refined they get. And you'll notice right here, right off the bat, I have one big red blob to the southwest portion of the city. Now you might be inclined to think, all right, this is my property crime hotspot. Just send people there and call it a day. But this is a good example of, specific characteristics in the data that you're querying can sometimes skew or alter or weight the heat map that's produced. And if we kind of zoom in closer, you'll see that this is actually a shopping mall. And if I turn off the heat map by unchecking this box and click on some of these, you can see it's just a series of shoplifting offenses that occurred at this mall. So not really a pattern or trend, more of kind of a chronic problem. We all know that shoplifting tends to occur at shopping malls or shopping areas. So maybe we want to remove this from the equation of overall property crime that we're looking at. So I can do that by dropping down my legend. I can uncheck the box for the shoplifting and then turn my heat map back on. Now I'm seeing more of a geographic kind of distribution of these hotspots. And if I zoom back, they become more generalized. If I zoom in, they get a little bit more defined. And if I want to, I can take a look at the hotspots by each different crime type. So I can click on deselect all here, and that'll clear out the map. And then I can start checking and unchecking by crime type here. So here are where my hotspots are distributed for residential burglary, which is different than where I'm seeing them for commercial burglary, motor vehicle theft here as well. And it's also important when you're using the heat map, I can toggle this on and off to see where the actual crimes are occurring, because the heat map is, the application is always going to force a hotspot relative to the data that's available here. So if I turn this on, and let's say zoom in here, I see I got a dark red hotspot over this location. If I uncheck it, I see that it's actually just 2 motor vehicle thefts that occurred along the same street here. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not, but the fact that it's just 2 of them may not be as significant as a more clustered area. So that's something to be aware of. When you're looking at these hotspots, it's a good way to highlight a specific area of interest and then zoom in and take a closer look at the activity that's actually occurring. We can also, if I pull up my charts and reports tab here, and maybe in this case we're looking at residential burglary, if I wanted to, I can interact with the day of week, time of day charts, these crime category charts. Maybe I wanted to see the hotspots that were occurring on Sundays for residential burglary. I could do that, or a specific time of day. But if you're wanting to, bring to the forefront potential temporal patterns, the best way to do that is in conjunction with this temporal grid chart here. So the temporal grid, it's just a cross tabulation of time of day and day of week. And so you have a cell for each hour of each day. So obviously the darker red, orange, and red the cells are, the higher volume of activity is occurring at that particular period of time. And as with the hotspot, I can uncheck and check these boxes and see that the temporal hotspots also change from one crime type to the next. So, for vehicle break-ins, more towards the early morning hours. Residential burglary is more in the afternoon. And if I wanted to isolate that hotspot temporally, what I could do is click on deselect all. So I'm clearing out the temporal grid here. And then I can start filling it in just by clicking on these cells and pull in those records that are occurring at this hot period of time. So 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., Tuesday through Saturday here. So now on my map, I just have the residential burglaries that occurred during those kind of peak hours of time. And so I can see there's a hotspot here, and maybe I can take a closer look at 3 residential burglaries that occurred here. So using the hotspot map in conjunction with the temporal grid, you can get focus in what you're looking at in terms of potential patterns and data. Now let's take a closer look. I'm going to hop into analysis mode because I want to see if I can get it down specific enough to where I have maybe some discernible or actionable, patterns that I can determine. In this case, I'm going to focus on vehicle break-ins, and I have a query on demand here already preloaded that I can bring up for this purpose. And the reason I like doing this in analysis mode, number one, it gives you a little bit more room to breathe. It's a wider screen here, and the charts and reports tab are a little bit bigger. The one other thing I really like, though, is in the result layers tab, it allows you to have the pin map and the heat map turned on at the same time. So you get the underlying hotspots on the map, but you also get the activity or the incidents that are occurring in and with around these hotspots. So we can take a closer look here, and we've got 3 different hotspots that are occurring just within this view. I can maybe zoom in closer on this one, and it looks like it's a series of vehicle break-ins that occurred adjacent to a train station, Amtrak station. There's a Greyhound bus station there as well. If I start looking at these, September 4th at 11, 8th between 8, they're kind of all over the place in terms of the date, but the time's always generally between 5 p.m. and midnight. So maybe there's not necessarily a pattern with the vehicle break-ins, but for that time period, maybe people are leaving their vehicles overnight, someone's getting off the train at that stop or that period of time. Maybe I want to take a closer look and see if there's any suspicious activity that's been going on in this area at that specific period of time. So I can bring in my query builder here, and I can, using the calls for service data, I can select suspicious calls, and I'll use my user-defined boundary option here. And I'm just going to draw a rectangle around this area. And then in the When tab, I'll select the last 30 days. And I'll also say I just want, for those 30 days, the slice of time of 5 p.m. to midnight. And I'll give this a name, so in my Result Layers tab, I know what I'm looking at. And I'll click Go. So now what I'll end up with is a summary of suspicious calls that have come in for that time period of 5 p.m. to midnight in the last 30 days. So we can see 36 records. So it seems, like a fairly significant number of suspicious calls that have come in. If I turn the vehicle break-ins back on, you can see, how some of them coincide in close proximity with some of this suspicious activity. So while this hotspot didn't maybe necessarily lead to a specific pattern of related incidents, it might. It kind of brought to the forefront a potential problem area that warrants further investigation. Now, if I want to try and find maybe something more specific, I can use the heat map in conjunction with the temporal grid. So I can bring up the temporal grid again here. And let's say I just want to focus in on this hot period of time temporally. So, Wednesday, from Wednesday through Saturday, from 2 to 5 a.m. in the morning. Again, I can deselect all these records and then just start choosing my cells here. And you can see we do have one kind of red spot here. If I zoom in closer and take a closer look at these, this occurred September 12th at 8 p.m., September 12th at 11 p.m., September 13th at 11 p.m. So we can see, this one's the 6th, but we've got at least 3 here that occurred around the same period of time, the same crime type, within the same 2-day period. So this might actually be something that we can then maybe take a closer look at the narrative or the additional MO data that you might have in the dashboard. If not in the dashboard, in your RMS, that you can pull up and see if there's any additional connections you can make. And then if you wanted to, you could create a spatial note in the dashboard, which is drawing a polygon, a line, or a note on the map, and sharing that out with the other users. I could draw a polygon around this, and I'm sure we'll have a future webinar which focuses just on spatial notes. But you can then share that out with other users and say, hey, I found this potential hotspot vehicle break-in. It occurs at this time of the day during this period, so just be aware of that. So we were able to discern that by using the temporal grid to kind of focus in what we were looking at. Another way of identifying hotspots is through the time sequencer. So the time sequencer allows you to, gives you the ability to kind of visualize the geographic and temporal changes through the map animation. Selecting a time period and then pressing play and watching how they change from one time period to the next. Now, if I wanted to, I could just manually click on these weeks and see, and let me pull back a little bit so you can get a better sense of what's going on. You can see how those hotspots change from one time period to the next, or I can look at it one day at a time. But really what you can do here, just if you're not looking for anything in particular, let's say I want to move forward in 3-day chunks of time, I select the first 3 days here, and I'll press play. And you'll see as it moves forward, those hotspots are changing from one time period to the next, moving around. And I'll stop it right here. And you can see in this 3-day period, there's quite a significant hotspot right down here. And in fact, if I just shorten this and look at the 7th and 8th of September, all of these are just occurring within that 2-day period. So if I want to, I can take a closer look at these records specifically. I can select them. So I can just click on each one of these, select them, and it's a little bit clunky to do it this way, but I'll just select a few of these just so you can get a sense of what I'm getting at here. So ultimately, once I select, let's say 6 or 7 of these, I can then go into my table. I'll do one more here. I'll go into my table, and right now it's just showing me a list of all of the larceny vehicle theft. So, but if I go into options and I select create selection filter, that's going to recreate this selection just to show those 7 records that I selected on the map. I can then sort by the date and time they occurred, and then by kind of selecting and unselecting these here, I can see the chronology of when these occurred in what order. So potentially, if this was one person or a group of people, maybe they started down in this area and then started to get braver and venture outward. So by using the time sequencer, I was able to focus down on a specific duration of 2 days, and then go down, select just those records, and then see chronologically in what order they occurred to see if there's any sort of pattern there as well. And if I wanted to, in this case, I could also create a spatial note to share out and say it looks like maybe there's an emerging pattern of vehicle break-ins in this area that warrants further investigation. In addition to just looking at the temporal grid and the hotspot, as I mentioned before, you can also use additional attribute information to kind of refine what you're looking for in terms of the patterns. And so what I mean by that, for example, I could look, instead of just by crime, I could say I want to see any hotspots for gun-related violent crime. So I could turn on the heat map, and in this case, so I've got a list of Part 1 violent crimes where a firearm was involved. I can see a hotspot in this area specifically. If I open up my chart here and look at the temporal grid, I can see a little bit of a temporal hotspot as well. So I can get pretty specific by using this in conjunction with, just saying I want all violent crime where, with the weapon use field, there's some sort of firearm listed. Similarly, I can use this in conjunction with the wildcard query. So wildcard query allows you to query a keyword or phrase in the data, and you can find it here in the What tab. And in this case, I queried the calls for service data, and in the narrative field, I said, return all records for the last 30 days where the word copper is in the narrative. So, hopefully trying to find areas maybe where there's been a string of copper wire or copper theft from residents or homes or that kind of thing. So by doing that, I can find any potential patterns, either spatially or temporally, for those areas where we might have an increase in copper theft. So here's some spatial potential patterns. If we look at the charts, we can look at the temporal grid, and clearly there's a bit of a spike on Sundays, so that's something that might warrant further investigation as well. So when using these, it's good to be as specific as possible if you're trying to find something actionable or something that you can, write a bulletin on or a spatial note. So you can use these trends these trend tools in conjunction with the attribute filters to find specific trends in the data. Another tool that we can use to identify potential patterns is the repeat location. widget or output. So with repeat locations, you get an output type that displays specific locations, so either addresses or intersections specifically, where activity is repeatedly happening over a period of time. So it's useful for staying informed on potential emerging problem areas or locations. It's helpful in promoting just situational awareness and safety for officers patrolling the area. So some use cases for repeat calls, we use it in conjunction with CAD data quite a bit. CAD data tends to be, there's usually quite a lot of records, a lot of noise in that data. So using the repeat locations in conjunction with CAD data can help kind of bring to the surface some frequent flyers, so to speak, in terms of repeat call activity. So some use cases we have here. It's used often for accidents, identifying hotspots for accident intersections or along the highway. Sometimes if an accident happens along the highway, it'll be geocoded to the closest exit or off-ramp. But it gives you a sense of where you might be having a problem in terms of vehicle collision. I have a repeat locations map here for assaults. And now when I created this, I thought maybe what I would end up with is maybe highlighting areas, maybe bars or other places where you're going to have, fights or assault activity. But what I ended up with is actually these two dots here are both over hospitals. So for whatever reason, I have repeat assault activity at 2 hospital locations over the last 30 days. So that's potentially something, I can't envision what that pattern would be, but it's possible there's something going on there. Shoplifting, so that's pretty straightforward where shoplifting is occurring, usually at retail shopping centers. Domestic calls are helpful for keeping officers informed so that they know if they're responding to a certain address or location. They say, okay, I know that we've come here, X number of times in the last 28 days for domestic related calls. And so they have that information all ready to go when they're responding. Repeat alarm calls. So this is, we can use this, and if I bring this into analysis mode, and you can bring any one of these widgets into analysis mode by clicking on the A here in the top right-hand corner. So if I click on this A, it'll bring this into analysis mode. And let me turn off this copper theft here. So now I can take a closer look at some of the alarm activities going on. Specifically up here to the north, I have 2 locations that have 2 large dots associated with them. And if I select one and look at the report data, you'll see that they're all burglary alarms. Now, it could be the case that some of these turn out to be false alarms, and it could be helpful. You could use the repeat locations tool to bring out these locations where you're having repeated false alarms, and maybe then go to these locations and do some education about what you can do for minimizing the number of alarms that are happening. But in this case, we have some burglary alarms that are going off. Let's say I want to take a closer look at this area and see maybe there is some residential burglary, commercial burglary that's going on there. What I can do is run another pin map, make sure my pin map is selected here, and I can select my burglary items. Like I did before, I can create a user-defined boundary, and I'll just kind of do it around this general vicinity up against the freeway here. Finish. And then in the When tab, I'll just say the last 30 days. I'll click Go. And it looks like over the last 30 days, we've actually had 11 residential or commercial burglaries that have occurred in this neighborhood or this area. So I was able to use this repeat locations tool to identify a potential area that I can then focus in closer and identify a potential string or pattern of burglaries there. And I can take a closer look at the MO, the victims, the property taken, and all that to see if there's a connection there. One final way or example I have here, you can use repeat locations. I have noise disturbances for the last 28 days. So, house parties, domestic violence calls, fights, that kind of thing. One interesting anecdote I heard from an officer was, they patrolled an area where college students lived. And so they were responding to noise disturbances, house parties all the time. And he found that quite often, a lot of the houses that he'd respond to for noise disturbance for a house party, he'd be back there a couple of days later taking a report for a burglary. And this was because, people would just walk in off the street into this party, case the house, and then come back at a later time and burglarize it. So not necessarily a pattern that you're finding, but it's a way to use the repeat locations tool to make potential connections or predictors, or to make a leap and see, well, maybe let me take a look at what's going on here burglary-wise, and maybe we need to inform our officers of that, increase patrol or increase, kind of education in that area in terms of what you can do to minimize residential burglaries. So that's a repeat locations tool. One final widget type here I want to look at, and this is going to focus in on the trends. So again, a trend is kind of a more long-term rise or fall in the data temporally, not looking at specific crimes or instances. So with the trend chart here, it's aptly named. This is the best way of potentially identifying those trends. And talking about when you're looking at long periods of time, the most time you can do in a trend chart is 90 days. And looking at this one here, one could argue possibly we're seeing a slight uptick in the amount of residential burglary that's occurring over time. Difficult to say. But one way that the trend chart is really helpful is for picking out potential spikes in activity based on the average trend. So the dashboard usually has a rolling 3 years of historical data, and we use that historical data to calculate averages. So looking at that same day last year, the year before that, and then factoring in some buffer days to create a generalized trend line. So you can see the red line in each one of these is what on average you would see for activity. What I also have overlaid, which is helpful, are these white lines. This is the standard deviation. So the variation from what we would normally see on average. And so I like to include these in here because then this gives you a real quick sense of where activity is spiking more so than what we've seen, outside the normal variance based on the average here. So you can see for commercial burglary, we've got some spikes over the lines, the white lines here. For theft from vehicle, we've got two pretty substantial spikes that go well over, what we would see in terms of variation. And if I wanted to, I could click on this bar for just these 22 records, and I could click on the A and bring these records into analysis mode. So now I have these 22 records. I'll turn off the other ones here, and I could investigate any potential patterns here. And there's the part of the hotspot we were looking at before. So using the trend chart, it allows you to pick out potential spikes or unusual variation in activity during a specific time period based on what you would see on average. And another way of doing that as well is through what we call the hot sheet or the alerting tab. So with these, it's similar to a widget or query on demand. If you're familiar with those, but you're creating a query and you're defining a baseline or a threshold and saying, if for the last 7 days, if I have X number of, let's say, residential burglaries or more, alert me to that fact. And you can get a quick look by doing that. You can do it by district or by beat. And you can see quickly where you're getting an unusual spike in activity based on what you consider that baseline to be. So in these examples here, in the central district, only a couple of crime types where there's a spike. In the southern district, we have all 5. I also have these created. You don't have to necessarily look within an administrative boundary. You could look around a feature as well. So I've got a listing of different train stations here looking at property crime and violent crime. And if I want to, I can see, oh, wow, at Station 1, there were 12 instances of some sort of Part 1 property crime over the last 7 days. I can click Go here, bring these 12 records into analysis mode, and you can see it draws that boundary around that feature here, and you can take a closer look at those and see if there's any relationship there. So those are the 2 different ways that you can actually utilize use the historical data or your knowledge of what historical baselines or thresholds are to identify and determine trends and patterns in the data. And we could go further into that, looking at ComStat reporting, comparing 2 different time periods, one to another, and looking at those hotspots are changing. look at how those crime types are varying from one period to the next. But I think somewhere down the line, we'll probably have a webinar specific to CompStat reporting where we'll cover all of that in detail. So with that, that pretty much covers everything, and I'm pretty much at the limit of about 25 minutes here. So we do have a couple minutes for a few questions, and let me take a look and see what we got here. So one question, playback, neat feature would be if you could select a time period and play back your data over time at various time scales to get a visual idea. So that might goes back to the time sequencer. So, and this question might have been asked before we actually got there. You kind of read my mind, but you know, we can look at the time sequencer. I bring up the table here to actually animate how those. And this is a bad example. See if I can find one. So you get the idea. Animate the sequence over time based on, you know, doing it one day at a time, one week at a time, chunk at a time, whatever the case may be. Okay, next question here. System IT. Okay, that's more of a comment, not a question. Last question I have here: trending for medical or fire examples. So we do have a FireView dashboard application, similar to the CrimeView dashboard. This webinar was specific to crime, but we certainly plan on having FireView-based webinars in the future. There's a lot of overlap between the functionality in the CrimeView dashboard and the FireView dashboard. You have all of that, you know, the heat map, the trend charts, the temporal grid, repeat locations, all of that is also available in FireView. There's also the additional added component of being able to track response time metrics. So evaluating response time performance, looking at it by area, by station. You can even look at it down at the unit level, how my unit's performing based at various response time metrics. So that would be something in the future we'll probably have, and we'll keep you all in the loop on when that's coming up. Any questions, any other questions? That's all I have on the list here for questions. Does anyone else have anything else that they wanted to ask before we end the session today? I don't see any other questions coming up. With that about does it for me. Like I said, we'll be having more webinars upcoming, so there's a lot more to come. Just keep your eyes open. We'll be sending out further email invitations for that. And with that concludes the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending today, and we'll see you again soon.